Welcome to part 2 of Tough Conversations, a framework for clinic owners. In this lesson, we're going to be going through the second half of the checklist. So please follow along, take some notes, and I'm excited to hear how you implement these with your team to continue to build and improve your leadership. Clarify your understanding. Communication is less about what is said, and it's more about what the other person hears. Now, the way to consider this is you have a worldview and a perspective, and the person you're talking to has a different worldview and a different perspective. And think of that perspective as a filter, and everything that comes through that filter is going to have their own bias on it. So when someone says something to me or to you, what's going to happen is you're going to run this through your filter and through your lens, and you're going to interpret those words in a certain way. And someone could say the same thing to you and to me. And what's going to happen is you're going to interpret that slightly differently, or maybe a whole lot different, but it could be very, very different to how I interpret that. And the same person said the same thing. So how can we get past this? Because a lot of the time, this is where issues come from. So when you are having a tough conversation with someone, make sure to clarify back your understanding to that person. Because that gives them the chance to do one of two things. The first one being agreeing and going, yeah, that's right. And they know that you were listening because you've clarified it back to them. And the second thing is, you might be wrong. You might have misinterpreted it. But at the same time, you're showing them that you're trying to listen and you want to understand, and it gives them the opportunity to correct your perspective on what they've said. Yes, and. Now, if you've ever done improv, you'll know this all too well. In improv, what you have to do is no matter what the person does or says, you have to build on top of that. So it's like these building blocks. You can't tear it down, you always have to build. And that's what we want to do in these tough conversations, is we always want to build on what the person has said rather than tearing it down. And the best way to tear down someone's conversation or someone's point is to say yes, but. Because when you say yes, but, you're saying yes, but you're completely wrong. And here's why you're wrong. And it just gets people really defensive. They shut off. And I know you've felt this before. It happens all the time. You've stood there, you've talked to someone and they've said, yes, but, and in your mind, you're like, well, you're not really listening to me. I'm trying to get this point across, but you're not listening. And we want to make sure that as leaders, we don't give other people that same feeling. Because what did you do in that situation? In that scenario, I can almost guarantee, unless you're really, really good at controlling those emotions in that moment, that you've put this wall up and you've gone, well, if they're not listening to me, I'm not going to listen to them. And that is one way to really railroad a tough conversation early on. So rather than saying, yes, but, can we say, yes, and? We may not agree with them. That's an interesting point, and that's an interesting view, and building on top of that. It doesn't mean you necessarily agree with that, but you can say, that's interesting, or yes, that's your point of view there, and build on top of that. And you got to find what works well for you. I find yes and works well for me. I find when something is I'm a little bit disagreeable, I might say, that's an interesting point. And can you tell me a little bit more about that? So actually diving in deeper. So rather than saying that they're wrong, seeking to understand more. And keeping in mind, the idea of these conversations is not to be right, it's to get to those shared goalposts, to get to the shared objective or the shared outcome that we've set early on in the piece. The next thing to consider is the words that we use. And one particular word that I think that we use way too often and can really hurt these conversations is the word why. Now, I don't know if you've ever felt this before, but the thing that really sticks out for me with the word why is I think back to when I was doing my 4th year in physio, and I would go into my placement and it was an MSK placement, and every time I'd finish with a patient, I'd come out and the tutor would say, why did you do that treatment? And I turned into this blubbering mess of I couldn't come up with the right answer, and I got all defensive, and all I could think is, this person, she's saying that I've done everything wrong and I'm trying to justify everything. I'm getting really defensive. And that is typically what happens when we ask someone, why did you do that? Or why did you choose this? It is a very, very attacking word. And there's a lot of research around this. It's quite interesting. And some of the prevailing thoughts around this is, and it's not just the tone, right? Because even when it's in a good tone, people can take it the wrong way, is that often when we're young, our parents, when we do something wrong, ask us, why do we do that? And so that's one of the prevailing thought patterns here. And so there's this subconscious bias here that when someone says why, they think you've done something wrong, and you can get very, very defensive. And I wonder, have you felt that before? When someone's asked you a why question and you felt a little bit attacked, even though they may not have meant it that way. Well, that's what we want to try and avoid. We want to make sure that we can instead ask a what or how question. What made you choose that? How did you come to that conclusion? It's a slight change. It's these slight changes we're making, these 1%ers, but these 1%ers can make all the difference in getting a really amazing result or a really terrible result. Finding the real challenge. How often does someone come to you and straight away you know the thing that they're complaining about, the challenge that they have, is not the real problem? But you may not know what the real problem is. And the best way I can describe this is we have problems and then we have perceived problems. And for most of us, we're aware of our perceived problems, but we don't know what the real problem is. So how can we help them to find that real problem? Now consider this. And I am not much of a handyman, by the way, but if I was to walk into my laundry and there's water everywhere, in my mind, my perceived problem is, oh shit, there's water everywhere, okay? The real problem is probably that there's a burst pipe, but my brain is not going to go there first. My brain goes straight to there's water on the floor, and my perceived solution is I need to get this water off the floor. And if we look at the real problem, burst pipe, real solution, fix the pipe. And that's typically how people are going to see these things. So when they come to you or when we're having this, they may only know the symptom of the problem. So they may only know the perceived problem, and we need to help them to find out what is the actual problem. Because too often when the person we're talking to brings up this perceived problem, we get stuck on it. We spend all this time talking about it. But a lot of the time, I know, and I think you know as well, that that's not the real challenge. So being, open and courageous enough to dig a little bit deeper and find out what is that real challenge? What is this a symptom of? And how is that going to actually be solved? Don't fear feelings. Now, guys, this is especially for you. We tend to be worse at this, but what you can't talk about holds power over you. And what I mean by this is if someone is feeling a little frustrated or angry, and you can sense this, but they're not actually talking it through, research has shown that it's actually better to point this out. Not in an annoying way, but to point it out in a way that helps to bring it to the surface so you can have a conversation about it. Because if you're both feeling a certain way, but no one's actually talking about the feeling, well then what happens? It kind of just bubbles and simmers under the surface until it explodes. So what we want to do here is actually be able to label the feeling. So how that may play out is I'm having a conversation with someone and Tim over here, Tim, I can feel is a little bit frustrated. So I say, Tim, I get the feeling that you're a little bit frustrated with this conversation at the moment. Now that gives Tim two options here. First option is he can say, yes, I am feeling frustrated, and we can talk about exactly what's making him frustrated. So we can actually talk about the feeling and take the power away from that feeling. Okay, it means we're putting it out in the open. The other option is I've misread that. I've got that wrong. And he says, I'm not frustrated. I'm actually just really disappointed because of X, Y, and Z. Okay, which is good as well, because now he's had the opportunity, like I said before, the opportunity to correct me. So now I understand the feeling that he has. And with that understanding, I can actually look at, well, how can we solve this problem? And we can talk about, all right, well, what's making you feel that way? But bringing those to the surface and actually talking about them is going to give you a much better result than trying to ignore how someone is feeling in front of you. Tame your advice monster. Our advice is most useful to us. Now, I know I've been there before myself. I'm working with someone and I know if I give them this piece of advice, it's going to solve their problem. Or I think I know that. And it's interesting really because this piece of advice is coming from my history, from something that I've done typically. It goes through my own biases, my own worldviews, my perceptions, and it may not be as applicable to that person as I think. And a lot of the time, we give advice too soon before really understanding the problem in front of us. It's like we don't have all the pieces to the puzzle yet because we haven't listened well enough. And then we try and give advice to solve the whole thing. But without those pieces to the puzzle, we can be way off the mark. So consider this. Have you ever been talking to someone before about a challenge that you've been facing? And that person has given you advice. They've jumped in without really understanding and they've given you advice. Now, whilst they've been giving you that advice, you're there thinking, you're sort of just sitting here thinking, Wow, this is absolutely useless advice. This is completely irrelevant to my situation. They don't really understand what's going on, and this advice is not helpful at all. But you sit there or you stand there very politely and nod and you say thank you. And why do you do that? Because you don't want to hurt their feelings. Because you don't want to say that, hey, this is actually really bad advice for me and you have no idea what's going on. But we want to, I guess, respect the fact that that person's really trying to help. And then we don't really want to ask them for help again. Because they haven't listened, they've just given advice. They don't know that they haven't helped us because we've said thank you for that. Right? I guarantee you've been there before. And I guarantee you've been on the other side. I've done it many times where I've jumped in and I've given advice, and on reflection, I'm like, wow, I probably didn't help them at all. I probably jumped in way too early. So how can we tame our advice monster and actually get them to solve their problem by asking them more questions? It doesn't mean we can't give any advice at all, but just wait, ask 2 or 3 or 4 more questions before you offer any advice, and only give that advice if they can't solve that problem themselves. Ask for their help. Now, this may seem a little weird, but stick with me on this one. When you're working with someone, by asking for their help to solve the problem, by asking a question like, if you were in my shoes, how would you support yourself through this challenge? What would you do in my position? It's a very powerful question because it does 2 things. The first thing it does is it means they have to see the world from your perspective, from your worldview, and they have to consider, well, how would I help myself? What support would I give myself? So it gives you some really great ideas for how you can help that person, how they believe that they should be helped. And the second thing it does is it means they're emotionally invested in the outcome that they've helped to come up with. So if they have said, this is how I would support myself, and you're able to give them that support, they're very emotionally invested in that working out. So consider that, my friends. The next step is to remember that core values should be the filter. So when we're doing this from a company and from a business perspective, we want to make sure that when we're having these tricky conversations, these tough conversations, that we're running through the filter of the core values. So when we're approaching this, which of our core values, if this is someone who's not doing something in line with our core values, or the way they're behaving or acting isn't in line, which of our core values is it not in line with? And really specifically pointing that out and challenging that. Because core values shouldn't just be something that sits on the wall behind you and you never really look at it, right? I've been there myself, don't worry. We've all done it. But we want to make sure that we're actually tangibly using these. And if you're having these conversations and none of your core values really actually fit, then maybe it's time to revisit the core values. Because as a company and as a team, you want to bring people together, and your core values should be this filter and this set of actions that we all agree to abide by in order to achieve our vision and our mission. So when we're having these conversations, it's very powerful to run it through the filter of which core value are we not acting in line with. Create a plan, because clear is kind. Understand, have a very clear understanding of what do you as the leader need to do to support this person, and have the person you're working with really understand what do they need to do, what are the KPIs they need to meet, what are the values they need to be aligned with, what is the time frame we need to achieve this in, and how are we going to work together to do this. So create a plan, write the plan down, and have another meeting booked in the diary for how you're going to support this person. Have it all mapped out. Make it as clear as possible. This is going to make people feel extremely supported, but not just supported, show them that you're a high-level performer, that you're a high-level leader who takes this very seriously, and you're going to be supporting and helping them in order to become the best version of themselves. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this Tough Conversations training. This, I believe, is one of the key aspects or key components of becoming an amazing leader. And in healthcare, in any business really, but especially in healthcare, with hiring and recruitment, as hard as it is at the moment, we need to be able to have these tough conversations to really show our team that we care, to help them to become the best versions of themselves, to improve our retention. And like anything, when we improve our product or our team, it makes it so much easier to hire, to grow our team, and to help more people and to achieve your goals. If you've made it this far, thank you very much, and I hope to work with you in the near future.